So if you are a child, family, or lifestyle photographer, you might be wondering whether you should get the 35mm or the 50mm lens. Now, these are two lenses that I see deliberated over a lot because they are very similar, but they do have some key differences. So if you have been having an internal debate between the two, this is the episode for you. Because in this episode, I am going to break down, first of all, what that 35 and 50mm refers to and how these focal lengths change between a crop frame and a full frame camera, just for anyone who is new to photography. We'll then go into the pros and cons of the 35mm lens and, most importantly, when you might use it specifically for child, family and lifestyle photography. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you will see example photos too. We'll also go over the pros and cons of the 50mm lens, again, what you might use it for specifically for child, family and lifestyle photography. And again, on YouTube, we'll be showing some example photos. I'll also talk about whether the 35 or 50mm is better in my opinion and my recommendations, and whether you need a 35mm if you also have a 50mm. Basically, by the end of this show, you should be able to figure out whether the 35 or the 50mm is going to be the very best lens for you. Now, if you are new here, hello, my name is Audrey-Anne and you are watching the Live, Snap, Love show, where every episode is a thoughtful mix of behind-the-scenes insight, practical tools, and inspiration for child, family, and lifestyle photography. So now let's get stuck in and look at the differences between the 35 and the 50mm lens so you can decide which one is best for you. Now, first, I want to rewind a little for any newer photographers, and let's just talk briefly about what the 35 and 50mm refers to. So the 35 and 50 just refers to the focal length of the lens. Now, in technical terms, the focal length of the lens is the distance between the lens and the image it forms on the sensor when focused at infinity. Now, in more helpful real-world terms, the focal length determines whether we can fit more or less in the frame. In other words, how zoomed in or zoomed out the image you see in the viewfinder appears. So longer focal lengths look more zoomed in. In other words, your subject will take up more of the frame than if you had a shorter focal length where your subject will look smaller in the frame and you'll be able to see more of that environment. Now, here is a very helpful rule of thumb. If you have a full frame camera, then a 50mm will give you roughly the same field of view as the naked eye. It's not exact, but it is close enough that you will know that when you put a 50mm on your lens, you're able to see roughly what you can with the naked eye. The 35mm, on the other hand, will allow you to fit more into the frame. In other words, everything will look a bit more zoomed out, and you will see more of the environment on either side of your subject. Now, you might be wondering, what if I have a crop frame camera? Well, when comparing the different focal lengths, you must take into account whether you are using a crop frame or a full frame camera. So if you have a crop frame camera, then it's actually the 35mm which will give you that field of view that is roughly the same as the naked eye. And a 50mm will be even more zoomed in. It will act more like an 85mm. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth into that, but if you are interested in learning more, you can go and give this video a watch. What do the numbers on a camera lens mean? Where we break that down. And I'll leave a link to that in the description wherever you are watching or listening to this episode. So let's turn our attention squarely onto the 35mm. We'll look at the pros and cons of this lens, and more importantly, the times or the instances where this lens is a winner and when you might not want to use it. So the first pro is you will get this wider field of view. So if you have a full frame camera, then as I said earlier, a 35mm is going to allow you to fit more into the frame than you can see with the naked eye. This means it's great for situations where you want to include more of the environment in the frame, or you need to be closer to the action. The second pro is that it doesn't have too much distortion. Although the 35mm is a wide angle lens, it's not so wide that you'll get distortion at the edges. So certainly not as much distortion as you would get with something like a 16 or even 24mm. This does make it a lot more versatile because you can also use it for things like group portraits without too much distortion at the edges. And the Third Pro, it is a great all-rounder. Because you can use the 35mm for so much, it can be a great all-rounder lens. Now, that's all very well, but I think one of the most important things to consider when you're looking at any lens is knowing when you would use it. So I'm going to give you now some specific examples of when you might want to use a 35mm lens. So the first is for any lifestyle or documentary photography at home, indoors, and you want to be able to include some of the environment. In fact, I think this is where this lens particularly shines, is this kind of at-home lifestyle documentary photography. In fact, when I got the 35mm lens, it was a lens that I didn't even know that I needed, but when I put it on, I immediately saw what hole it filled in my lens collection, and it was this indoor lifestyle photography. It's also fantastic to use indoors in other locations, again for lifestyle and documentary photography, such as when you're out at a restaurant, in a shop, in an aquarium, any other indoor location. Now, I will also use it for indoor group or family shops where you can't back up too much. So if I'm indoors, I might use this lens for more group portraits. You will also use it outdoors, again for lifestyle and documentary photography, where you want to include some of the environment. And again, some examples for this would be shooting at the beach, climbing a mountain, out with the kids, even at the park, wherever you want to be relatively close to your subject, but still capture more of that environment. Now, it's also fantastic for things like street photography or just a general walk around lens. So when I'm on holiday, I'll often take this lens with me as well. So are there any times when I wouldn't use or recommend using the 35mm lens? Well, the first is for general portraits because there are other lenses that are going to do a much better job, like my 85mm or 135mm. So I don't generally tend to use that for portraits unless it was a group portrait. And I also won't use it at the times when I really want to have good background blur because it's that shorter focal length, you don't get as much lens compression, so it doesn't give you the great background blur that you can get with other lenses. So the 35mm is an ideal lens for any kind of documentary, lifestyle photography, any kind of street photography it's good for as well, and also for group portraits. Okay, let's move on now to the 50mm lens, and we will take a look at the pros and cons of this, and again, when I would use it. So let's start with the first pro, and that is what you see is what you get. So as I said before, on a full frame, the 50mm will give you roughly the same view as the naked eye. It is not exact, but it is close enough to have that reference. That means you don't need to figure out where you need to stand and whether you need to be further back or further forward. So it can be incredibly easy to use. The second pro is that it is versatile and it is a good all-rounder. So this lens isn't considered wide angle or telephoto, it's just a normal standard focal length. And as such, it can be endlessly versatile. You could use it for single portraits, group portraits, some street photography and some lifestyle or documentary photography. So it can be a bit of a good all-rounder. And the third pro is that there is no distortion. This lens is not wide angle, unlike the 35, so you don't get any distortion at all on the edges or in faces, so you don't have to worry about that or worry about making people's faces look bigger. So let's turn our attention now to when you might want to use the 50mm lens and what type of images it is great for. So the first type of images that this lens excels at is when you are outdoors and you want to have a lens that can give you a mix of environmental and portrait style images. So if you don't want to switch between two lenses and you want to be able to take images that show the environment and then switch to taking a more portrait style image, then this can be ideal for that. You can also use it for indoor portraits, especially when you can't use a longer length lens because there's just not enough space to back up in the room. So I will sometimes use it for indoor portraits. And you can also use it for outdoor lifestyle images as well. Just allows you to be that little bit further back from your subject. And if you wanted to just pack one lens, this can also be a really good all-rounder and an alternative to the 35mm lens that we mentioned earlier. So when would I not use a 50mm lens? So the first is when I do want to include more of the environment. I just find that a wide angle is going to be better for that, especially if you need to stay closer to your subject, like you're photographing a toddler. Indoor lifestyle photography, because it can just be that little bit tight indoors when you want to show some of the environment and you want to capture your subject. So indoors for lifestyle photography, documentary photography, but even places like a small church or a shop or a restaurant, it can just be that little bit wide for that. And again, just like with the 35mm, anytime I want good lens compression, because if I want that lots of background blur, then there are other lenses that are going to do a better job of that. And I generally wouldn't use this lens just for portrait style images. If I was only taking portraits, again, I would switch to a lens that was more ideally suited for portrait style images. So for me, although the 50mm is a good all-purpose lens, it just sometimes lacks that oomph that you get with other lenses. If I want that wide angle feel, then something like a 35 or even a 16mm is going to be better. If I want to take portraits, then I'm more likely to reach for my 85 or my 135 again, so I can get that slightly slimming effect and get that beautiful lens compression there in the background. It's also great for times when you want to just pack one lens, because it's that workhorse that can do so many things, might not excel at any of them, but it can lend its hand to a number of types of images, then it can work really well for that. Might also be great if you only want to have one lens and you want one that can do multiple different things. So is the 35mm or the 50mm better? Well, in my opinion, there's no out-and-out victory lap for either of these lenses because it's really going to depend on the type of photography that you do and which one you feel would give you the most use. That's ideally what you're looking for. Now, if you have a full frame camera and you only want to have one lens and you want to be able to shoot portraits and you want to be able to shoot environmental portraits and you want a kind of walk around lens, then a 50mm might be a good bet for you because it's that kind of workhorse of a lens that it can turn its hand to just about anything. It's a bit of a jack of all trades of lenses. Because it's neither telephoto or wide angle, it does sometimes give you that best of all worlds, even though it's not the perfect lens for all of those things. However, if you shoot indoors a lot and you want more of a lifestyle feel, so if you're photographing your own children and you want to be able to photograph them indoors, at the park, when you're in places like restaurants or, you're visiting a museum or an aquarium, then I do believe that you would be better off with the 35mm lens. Now, do remember that if you have a crop frame camera, then this is all changed because that 35mm lens on a full frame camera is going to act more like a 50mm and do all the things that we spoke about for the 50mm lens and what that is good for. Whereas if you have a 50mm and you pop that onto an 85mm lens, then it is going to act more like an 85. It's going to be even more zoomed in and it's going to act more like a really good portrait lens. So please do keep that in mind if you have a crop frame camera. Now you might be wondering, do I need a 35mm lens if I have the 50mm lens, and vice versa. Now, I actually have both. I have both the 50 and the 35 because I bought the 50 first, and then I hummed and hawed as to whether to get the 35, and I ended up getting it. And as I say, I found that that was almost like my missing lifestyle documentary photography lens for indoors, just for capturing the daily life of my child and my family. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you have both though, because I do feel that they're so close in focal length and they kind of overlap a little bit. So if money is no option, then you can absolutely have both the 35 and the 50. They are obviously slightly different, but if you're going to get two lenses, I would actually recommend getting something more like the 35 and the 85mm and just leaving out the 50. 35 is great for, as I've said, that lifestyle lifestyle documentary images indoors. It's also great for outdoors, environmental style images, environmental portraits, great walk around lens, great street lens. You can do group portraits with it. And then when you want to do more pure portraits, you can then stick on your 85mm instead. So I don't believe that you need both the 35 and the 50 unless money is absolutely no object and you want to be able to cover every single focal length possible. Now, if you do want to see 35, 50, 85 and 135 and example images for each, we do actually have a free Which Lens Kickstarter guide. It talks a lot about what we spoke about here from 30 and 50, but you'll also learn about the 85 and 135. So you can go ahead and download that. It's completely free. Go to livesnaplove.com/lenses. That's livesnaplove.com/lenses. And as normal, I will leave a link to it around where you're listening to this podcast or watching the video. Now, if you are still a little bit undecided between the 35 and the 50mm and you have a zoom lens, then what I recommend you do is just turn your zoom lens to 35mm, keep it at that for a week, see how you like it, then change it to 50mm, keep it there for a week and see which one you like the best. Because if you have a zoom lens, it is going to allow you to use both of those focal lengths and you'll be able to see much more clearly which one it is for you. And if you don't have a current zoom lens that you can use, then I really would just consider what you are aiming to do with this lens. So any lenses you buy should fill a gap in what you are currently photographing. So if you feel that you are missing more lifestyle, documentary indoor lens, then without a doubt, reach for that 35mm. Especially if you want to do group portraits as well. That's going to give you an excellent lens for that. Whereas if it's not really looking to fill a gap as such, but you want one lens that's a bit more of a good all-rounder, then I would plump for the 50. Now, if you have decided whether you're going to go for a 35 or a 50, then you will also find a links to some recommended lenses, including the ones I use for the 35, which I absolutely love. And I will leave a link to those inside the description. And now I would love to hear from you. If you don't have either of these lenses, which one do you think you would get and why? And if you do have them, let me know which one you prefer. If you're watching this on YouTube, then please just leave that in the comments. It's so insightful for other people to be able to see what other people are using. So please do leave a comment and let us know. And if you're listening to the podcast, come and find me on Instagram as @LiveSnapLove and let me know there. I always love to hear from you. So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you're here on YouTube, then do make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. And if you are on the podcast, do make sure to leave a review. This helps us get found by more and more people. And it's so helpful for people like myself who create free content because it allows us to create more and better free content as well. But wherever you are, please do make sure that you subscribe so that you can stay notified the next time we release an episode. So thank you so much for being here and I will see you again at same time, same place next week. Bye for now.